Welcome to the Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others. Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Studios, Rochester, New York, mouth off at RockVox, rockvox.com. Having enjoyed an almost 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, Executive and Recovery Coach, Keith Greer.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, as always, for making the time to sit in on this episode of the Helping Conversation. As we have talked about in past episodes, one part of doing this podcast that has been so enjoyable, at least for me, has been expanding our definition of what a helping conversation is, away from just thinking about maybe folks like me in the coaching or counseling realm, and moving to a variety of other areas where people engage in a specific conversation that helps others, helps a group, or helps an organization. And there's probably no better example of the power of a helping conversation than the one that comes from a leader, somebody who is acting on the practice of leadership. And I found myself often thinking in my work across some different industries about the lack of really effective, significant leadership. And I have a couple of thoughts on that, one of which is I still believe to this day that we greatly underestimate leadership as a distinct skill set. And so very often in different kinds of work environments, we find people who are technically brilliant at what they do. And we just automatically assume, let's take that person and now have them become a leader. And so now this person maybe is in charge of a team of about 10, and no one ever asked, does this person have that skill set? Which is, again, a distinct skill set from whatever their technical competence is. I see it in the tech arena where I've worked. I see it in the human service arena. The same concept. I have a sister, as many of you know from one of my previous episodes. In the financial world, we talk about this all the time. And so what are some of the skills of leadership that we can teach people, at least get curious with people, about whether it is something they are interested in? Because that's the other side that I've been privileged at times to be in a conversation with people who have been elevated into a position of leadership because of their technical competence, who have said to me in great confidence, I never wanted to be a leader. I don't want to be the person who leads. I thoroughly enjoy the work that I do in my world, but this was the only way, quote, to move up, right, or to advance your career. So some skills of leadership include the ability to connect with others. And more and more and more we're reading in the world of leadership about leading in a more compassionate, empathic way than maybe previous generations, which was, tell, sell, yell, or convince, coerce, and control. That leadership now brings also a great level of self-awareness. Right, so we talk about interpersonal skills, my ability to interact with others. And then there's the whole skill set called intra, I-N-T-R-A, intrapersonal skills, which is my self-awareness of what I bring, in this case, to leadership, to my ability to engage with others, to help people grow, which is another part of leadership. My ability to give feedback in a more coach-like way than maybe in past generations. And the flip side of that is, as a leader, my ability to accept feedback on how I'm doing as a leader and to make myself vulnerable, which I've talked about before on here. One of the things we know in the world of conversational intelligence and the neurochemistry of trust is that when a leader shows vulnerability, it actually helps to produce the neurotransmitter of oxytocin in the brain of the people they lead, which causes those people to feel closer and more trusting to their leader in showing some vulnerability. And one of the other thoughts I had about leadership is the ability to take action and make recommendations for the good of the organization, not necessarily for the good of you. So how do leaders which the practice of leadership does require some strength of ego, still then have the ability to put a little bit of that ego aside and make sure that this is for the good of the many, instead of just me. I found this quote that I thought was really cool. Herminia Ibarra is a professor of leadership and author of Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. Leader is a big amorphous word, and it's almost arrogant to attach it to yourself. Transitioning from seeing your contribution in terms of the technical skills to seeing your contribution in terms of being able to marshal people towards something new is a process. Once you make an effort to influence a person or a group, and people increasingly recognize you for that capacity, it starts to feel like it's legitimate, that title of leader, that you might be good at it, and over time you start to internalize the identity. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. I'm thrilled to have this gentleman with us as we explore this conversation of leadership and leadership as a distinct helping conversation in helping to move other people along. Luke Layman is a decorated fighter pilot, serial entrepreneur, investor, and transformation coach. With decades of experience leading high-performance and high-growth organizations, Luke has cracked the code on how to live with intentional alignment, enjoying all the best that life has to offer, while sustainably growing businesses across the globe. He has led multiple 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as leading the highest-performing organization in the United States Air Force. Amongst his many accolades, he is the recipient of a Combat Action Medal and Single Mission Air Medal for combat operations flown in the A-10 Warthog. Additionally, Luke is the recipient of multiple business awards, including being voted top 40 under 40 in 2019. Luke's entrepreneurial Accelerator framework is the method he applies in his own businesses, as well as those he invests in. His pillars for success are creating high-performance mindset and leadership, sales and marketing strategy, and creating leverage systems. And please join me in welcoming in to the Helping Conversation, Luke Layman. How are you, Luke?
I'm well, Keith. Glad to be here today.
Thank you so much for making the time. We were just talking about sitting in sunny and a little bit warmer than Rochester, New York, North Carolina. But appreciate you being here to have this conversation. So I always ask my guests to start at the beginning. So a little bit of a synopsis on how you came to where you are, specifically for you in the world of leadership.
Well, it's a journey, Keith. You know, it doesn't come overnight, and I think that there's probably the best realization that you could ever have about leading and learning is that they never stop.
Right.
That you're always going to be on a process of constant improvement. For me, the story goes back, it obviously can be pretty young growing up in Central North Carolina, but thinking about flying airplanes and started with helicopters. And I used to have my parents chase me around to the life flight helicopters landing at the hospital. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever to watch somebody, land that helicopter and then save a life. And that, that's probably a pretty good example of leadership, as someone who's away from their family, doing the things that they've been called to do to help others.
Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of goes right into my second question I often ask, which is I'm a very big believer that those of us who are out there in any kind of helping conversation and maybe leadership in particular, it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we find ourselves. Sometimes I use the term find ourselves at the front of the room. It seems to be who we are, and it seems to be a pretty comfortable place for us. So I always get curious about if I knew you when you were a kid or a teenager, what was the evidence back then, based maybe on things you were involved in, how you carried yourself, that you were destined to be out there helping the world in the form of being a strong leader?
I'm gonna be a little self-deprecating here a little bit, Keith. I'm gonna tell you, my freshman year in high school, I had an English teacher who said that on my report card where I got an A, that said that Luke is more interested in being the center of attention than paying attention, and that did not go well for my mother, as you can imagine. I was just
thinking that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was. But what was interesting there was some some version of competence.
Yeah.
Obviously reflected in my ability to perform in school. There's some version of confidence in that. But I think for me is realizing that my desire to be a leader. It took me quite a while to realize, and as I listened to you in your intro, realize that not everyone wants to be the leader.
Right.
Not everyone wants to accept the responsibility. And then when you do accept that responsibility, that the gravity it carries to be the leader. So I think back, and Miss Garrison probably doesn't remember telling me that I'm more interested in being the center of attention, but that probably my freshman year in high school was when I really began to realize that I was going to be on a trajectory there, that I would probably be standing in the front of the room, like you say.
Yeah. I'll just share a quick story because I had a similar comment on my report card. And I tell this story all the time. It's a bit dramatic, over dramatization. But I like to tell people that from the first day of kindergarten to the last day of 12th grade, 4 report cards a year, every single report card said, Keith socializes too much. And there's truth there. And when I think back, again, that was me. I've always been fascinated with people. I wanted to talk with people. I do well within the world of relationship. And like you, that was not a comment that my parents were really thrilled about when the report card came home. So let's kind of jump from childhood and adolescenthood into the adult world. When you arrived as an adult, where were some of the first places that you brought that interest and a natural skill set and passion for leadership?
Leadership is an interesting thing for me because I think at any given point, you're both the leader and the follower. And I think that dichotomy exists in many places in the world. In business as well, I say that you're oftentimes the carrot and the rabbit at the same time. And I think back probably to college and then really early into my Air Force career there, as you're learning to fly airplanes, there's certainly a level of followership that's to be expected. There's a certain level of leadership that's to be expected. And that handoff of power happens quickly, and I can specifically think back into an airplane there where sometimes it's a life or death decision. There's an instructor sitting in the back seat of the airplane. And if he says, I got the airplane, well, it's your turn to quickly become a follower. But when the controls are handed back, now it's your turn to lead and it's your turn to make decisions and to speak with authority and confidence. And, I think that's for me, Keith, as I think forward. And if I ever have to interview for a job again and someone were to say, Luke, tell me what you bring to this organization, my answer would be that I make decisions that are 90% correct with 80% of the information. And I think I can probably sum up a lot of my leadership into that colloquialism.
How did you come to that? That's an interesting mathematical equation.
Well, I think you first have to realize that 86% of all statistics are made up. What I found here, Keith, and we kind of skipped a lot further forward, is that the times when I was least effective were the ones that I sought the most information. Yeah. And I'm not being an advocate for making reckless decisions, right, or even advocating for trying to make decisions with not enough information. However, realizing that perfection, that chase to have everything exactly in order, is the enemy of progress, right? And there's lots of folks that have spoken about that. But for me, as I've found that if I can get to a place where I have enough decision to make the information, all I want to do is I just want to take the next first step.
Yeah.
And that next first step is going to lead to the next first step. So as long as I have somewhere I'm going and I have somewhere to deviate from, then I get the piece of information. I look for feedback in the environment to tell me what the next step is going to be.
Yeah. So part from what I hear you saying is part of how you think about leadership is avoiding that potential of paralysis through too much analysis. My feet can get stuck in the mud, gathering too much information, not being willing to make the decision and see what comes of it and then evaluate.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So was the service for you right after high school that you were in the service?
Right after college. So I went to NC State in North Carolina first
Right.
and completed the Reserve Officer Training Program there, ROTC, and then straight into flying airplanes after college.
Okay. All right. And so talk a little bit more about that experience in the service, because that seems to be a pretty profound moment in your life in figuring out how to act on this propensity to be a leader.
Well, it certainly was. And for me, some of the things that a lot of the folks that join the military are paved their foundations through their family. There's going to be a member of their family somewhere. And there was, my grandfather, and I had an uncle who was in the Navy. But realistically, the concept of being in the military was something that was born on my own.
Right.
And I had really no real expectations for what that was going to look like. I certainly didn't, think about flying airplanes initially. I knew that would be a cool thing to do. But as I got into pilot training and went forward and began to go, okay, I believe I'm selecting forward into that next piece of it. It was kind of a journey and a path that I had to take on my own. And, what's interesting, and we'll talk probably some of this today, is that there was a lot of limitations in my mind that I was projecting upon myself. And one of the things, and this is in leadership and business and life, I realized this much later in life, that folks fear the most are the fear of inadequacy and the fear of judgment. And when I go back into that early days of pilot training was, of course, there's inadequacy, right? You're probably going to, fail the ride, or you may fail the ride, or you may not know enough information. That propensity to learn and study and study and study and try new things. So, for me, that foundation of leadership was internal. First, it was just making sure that you knew which way you were going, and then probably shortly thereafter into my early military career, a couple of years into it. Now you really had the opportunity to lead, and I'll tell you a funny story about leading in the bar of a fighter squadron. But it's a bunch of lieutenants who are none superior to the other, and nobody wants to make the popcorn. But there's got to be one leader who's going to make the popcorn. So pure leadership became the first challenge, and that was a hard one to learn, was how to lead a group of your peers.
Right. What? So I'm curious. Just what would you say is the primary challenge in that kind of setting when everybody has the same title?
Well, peer leadership is, I believe, one of the hardest. There's, when you talk about the power bases, if I have referent power or position power over someone, and I don't mean that as a projection of power, but if I stand in front of a room as an authority, or if I have rank on my shoulder, even if I'm the president of the United States, I have a certain level of position power, and I get to say whatever I want to say. Then referent power is the one that's earned, and that's the hard one, but that's the one that carries you the most weight. So, in a group of peer leadership was really a matter of going out there and being the expert, making sure that you knew which way you were going and doing the right things at the right time. But also it was a matter of, how do you convince a group of people that are your peers to follow you?
Yeah.
And this kind of goes back to putting the first step forward. There was a great way to get everybody else to sweep the bar. You swept the bar. If I picked the broom up first,
right,
it was a lot easier to get everybody to join me than it would be to try to tell them that the bar need to be swept.
Right. So that piece of leadership you often read about, which is, it's not about dragging people. All right. It's not about pulling people. It's doing what you do that people are going to make the decision themselves. I'm following this guy.
That's right.
Right. Much more powerful. And much more long lasting. So what was the transition like for you from your time in the Air Force to now I leave the service and I decide I'm going to be an entrepreneur? Talk about that journey a little bit.
Certainly not as clairvoyant as I would tell the story right now, right? As I separated from the Air Force, I had a young daughter at home, a wife that relied upon me for, financial stability and income. At that point, we were living in Southern California and thinking about where we would live in the future. There's no difference. It's really easy to look back and to see with such clarity how easy the path was. But when you're in it, it's not easy. And, one of the things, and we talk about coaching, Keith, is that finding mentors that can help you along the way, that can point those things out for you.
Right.
And I still need them today, because I am less confident of seeing what's in the future. And I think I posted something on social media not too long ago. I had an instance, and it's funny because it reflected back upon me, but my daughter at 6 years old at the time was at a playground on what was probably a 12-foot obstacle that she had to climb over. And she gets to the top of it with pretty good strength. And she gets to the top of it. She couldn't figure out how to put her foot down to the other side. And as I look at her, I know, I'm like, you just got to put your foot down. You're literally inches from success. And once you feel that success, now you'll have the confidence to know that you can continue down on the other side. And if I were to take that back into 6-year-old version of my daughter, into 40-year-old version of myself, is what is the same thing that I'm going through right now, that I'm just inches away from success, but without knowing it and feeling it and be able to taste it, that I just don't have the confidence to move forward. And I think back into that Air Force transition there, as you leave the relative safety and security of the military for all the things that it may not be. I'll tell you that it's a very secure environment.
Right.
You're with a lot of like-minded folks.
Yeah.
You share the mission and the vision and that commonality, and the security of knowing that your paycheck's not going to go away, and that there's a retirement at the end of the road. That's a hard thing to leave. So,
right.
That transition probably was a little easier for me to tell a story about many years later than it was to actually live it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what was next after the military? What was the first project, the first direction you moved in?
Go fly airplanes. I like everybody else. What do pilots do? Well, pilots go fly airplanes. So I, put an application in at Delta Airlines and got hired to go be a Delta Airlines pilot. Until I found out that flying Delta Airlines was not for me.
Right.
The idea of closing the door, and it's a beautiful airline, and I still fly it as a passenger, but the idea of closing the door and turning your brain off from the outside world for a period of 4 or 5 hours and focusing solely on the instruments was not not my best use of my time and energy. Right. Or dharma. So, the foray into the business world, the interesting thing is, I thought that when I was a fighter pilot, I used to think that fighter pilots had something to tell executives about leadership and management. And the interesting thing is they probably do, but without having the frame of reference for me to have a shared understanding of what that executive was going through, I really didn't have it. So I started the business thinking that I was going to be a management consultant. Did it one time, consulted all the way to the bank one time, and then figured out that I probably needed a little more expertise. And I don't think I was wrong on that. I think having a shared commonality and an understanding of what it takes to lead from the executive position in a boardroom. But now, coming back to it, there's a lot that I learned inside the cockpit or inside a debrief room about what leadership looked like, that I now bring into the day-to-day of the way that I run my businesses.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned a few moments ago something that I'm thinking is one of the biggest roadblocks for folks who are thinking about leading or leading in the best way possible. And that is this fear of inadequacy and fear of judgment. So talk a little bit about that from the standpoint of how you move past it, and or how you might coach and mentor somebody who finds themselves really stuck in that mindset.
Well, the first thing, Keith, and I think you nailed it a little bit earlier, is that the way that you coach someone has to take a different shape. And as much as we would like to be able to give someone a how-to or a tutorial, play-by-play, you don't move people by telling them how to do things. You move people by helping them understand it. You make them share their perspective and move their thoughts to what that next version of it's going to be. So, I love and talk often about this concept of limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs are great in retrospect. It's easy for me to look back and to grab a specific thing that I thought and to challenge that thought 10 years later. But that belief at that point was not limiting. It was a fact.
Right.
It was the lens that I was viewing the world through. It was a perception that I had that wasn't ready to be challenged. So, the easiest way for me to think about this is you have to give things names, call it what it is. If it is anxiety, give it anxiety. And
Right.
I'll tell you, one of the biggest things about 5 years ago, I walked into a room and I said, I carry myself with an 8 out of 10 on the stress level, and I carry myself well. And I was right about 50% of that equation. And that was that I had my stress at 8 out of 10, but my perception of the time was that I carried myself well. But I also accepted that my anger and my frustration and my tenacious work ethic that had me working 60 and 70-hour weeks were all just part of the job. It wasn't a limiting belief. It was my reality at the time. And as I moved forward years later, I had someone once tell me that you project upon others the things that you most fear in life.
Right.
And I go, I don't fear anything. I'm a fighter pilot. I have no fears. Until you begin to realize that fear of inadequacy and that fear of judgment is present in your life. And now I look at it very critically to go, where else in your life do you also feel inadequate or fear judgment?
Right. That's a very, I imagine that is a very, for the person you might be in that conversation with in your work as a coach and a mentor, that's a very vulnerable place for human beings to go, to be willing. It's a courageous act to be willing to go there and get curious with yourself about where inadequacy and or judgment might show themselves in your life. So I'm curious in that moment, as you start to enter into that conversation, what you do to bring a focus on the creation of a trusting and safe space, because my hunch is that conversation is not happening unless that space is there.
Well, first and foremost is that you have to establish that judgment-free zone.
Right.
And we do that as leaders by building empathy, which you've already talked about, right? We don't follow people that we don't want to follow. We don't follow people that we don't trust. So, part of it is just having walked that road before.
Yeah.
And having been there. I tell the story of Thanksgiving a couple of years ago where I was sitting there waiting to go pick up some food, and I felt this tingling in my arm, this sensation. I'm like, this is it. This is the heart attack. This is what they talk about. I'm going to be 37 years old, and I'm going to be laying here in this beautiful corpse in this white Chevy Tahoe. And it turns out that it was not that. It turns out that as I drove myself to the emergency room, that it was anxiety.
Right.
And it turns out that as I did not know about myself, and that acclimation to the stress level was that instantaneous stress is different than cumulative stress. Right. And the way that I felt flying jets and hurling myself at 400 miles per hour to the ground is different than 7 years of entrepreneurial stress. So, I think that's first and foremost is when you're working with someone is that you really got to let them know that there's a high level of empathy, not sympathy. It's not that I feel bad for you. It's that I fully understand because I can feel the way that you feel.
Yeah.
And then once we've established that rapport and that empathy, and I do it in peer groups, I do it in all kinds of forums now, is that again something that you hit on is you have to ask intelligent questions. You have to ask the smart questions that probe. It's never the why question, it's the what and the how.
Yeah, right.
So that we can actually begin to peel the layers of the onion back.
Yeah. What I loved about what you just said is how often. Not that people confuse, although they do, empathy and sympathy, but how even people's perception of empathy is I can only be empathic if I have a very similar shared experience. And you defined it much more specifically, which it's not shared experience, it's shared emotion. That I have some experience in my life that allows me to go to this similar emotional space that you're in, and in the name of us connecting and in the name of creating trust and safety, which again is a courageous act on both parts for both people to do that. And
absolutely, Keith. And where it gets, those conversations are the best is when everybody walks in with their armor down. Right. And whether or not that's in a relationship with your spouse,
Yeah.
whether or not that's in the boardroom. That can be an interpersonal, it could be on the subway in New York City, right? When you walk in with a willingness to leave your armor down and a vulnerability,
Yeah.
that's where that true progress is going to happen.
And you and I both know that historically, what you just said would not be how most people in the past would conceptualize leadership. That wouldn't have been a part, even 10, 15 years ago, that wouldn't have been a part of it. And so can you talk a little bit about the role of what you just said in leadership? Because it's still a relatively new way to think about doing this work.
Well, yeah, I tried to write it down. You wrote tell, sell, yell, coerce, convince, and control. Is that what you said?
Right. Yeah.
I love that. We used to say in the military that leaders led with fear, sarcasm, and ridicule. And that concept, that's not leadership.
No.
That's actually not even management.
Yeah.
That's really just bad management.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the power basis, Keith. If I have position power over you, because I am in a position of authority, I can use that generally one time. I can tell you to do that. And this is kind of like, it really, I can go back to my 7 and 5-year-old. I can tell them to do something, but I'm going to run out of that capital very quickly.
Yeah.
If I can convince someone to do the thing because they believe in it, then we're going to have a higher chance of success. So really, when we come back down to leadership, and this is the use of the referent power base, is I want you to follow me because you're a believer in the way that I communicate, the way that I see things, the shared vision and mission. That goes back into the military. You want to find an organization that is completely in lockstep. Go into a squadron in the Air Force, a battalion in the military, go to a deployed ship, a ship in the aircraft carrier in the middle of the Persian Gulf. There is no more clear sense of shared mission than in that group of sailors and Marines that are on that ship.
Right.
But in leadership is, I tend to lead in the way that I want to be led. And I think most of us do that, but I want that empathy. And if I build that rapport base, and if I build that referent power, now when it comes time for me to have to ask someone to do something bad, I'm not asking them from a position of power. I'm asking them from a position of mutual respect.
Yeah.
And those things take different shapes. It used to be, will you go fly across the fence with me in Korea so that we can go, fight the North Koreans, or can I go into a fight in Afghanistan? Now it's, will you work the weekend with me?
Yeah.
Would you put 2 hours in on a Sunday afternoon because we didn't quite get through our work week? And when I'm asking somebody to take that bad deal, I need to make sure that I've already led them. And the thing that I'm going to ask of them now is the capital that I'm going to be asking for from likely weeks or months worth of what I put into that relationship.
Right. So that's the piece I was thinking of when you said that, will someone follow me out of respect? It's more than that. It's relationship. I've done the work in my leadership to create relationship, true, sincere relationship with this other human being, which, as you said, is capital. It's money in the bank for when I might need to make a request.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right.
I also think it's money in the bank at a moment when I maybe need to give feedback, because leaders and coaches, I always say, we all speak the truth. That's part of what we do. And yet speaking the truth sometimes can be challenging. But if that person knows this person has demonstrated in a million different ways that he has my back, he cares about me truly and sincerely, then in that moment where in leadership you might have to offer that feedback, that process often goes a bit more productively.
Mm-hmm. Feedback is a fun one. That's a fun conversation. And leaders fail at that. I actually wrote a note while you were talking earlier. There's a book that I read many years ago called First Break All the Rules. I don't know if you've read that.
No, I haven't. I love the title.
It's a great book. A Gallup poll, if I recall correctly, that looked at what leaders were doing different, by whatever metrics that they they assign for successful businesses: low turnover, high profitability, or whatever it is. And there's some really salient points in that book. But feedback is an interesting thing. Feedback is generally, when we talk about beliefs, this is a perception that I have, vice a perception that you have, where I am going to try to offer a new way for you. I'm going to try to move you from position of A to B. And what I see all too often in feedback is that, number one, there's a lack of clarity.
Yeah.
Is that we muddy the water. Feedback is, when we say feedback, it's often construed as negative, and it doesn't need to be feedback that's negative. I give all kinds of feedback that speaks to things that people did well. And matter of fact, if I give you 10 attaboys, it makes that one problem that we have feel not so bad.
That's right.
Now, if you've got 10 problems, then we got something else to talk about. But when we try to move someone to a shared understanding, and that's part of it, I guess, as leaders, is that we have to be confident and resolute that we're doing the right things.
Right.
Because I want to make sure that I'm going to move folks forward into something that's going to lead them away from peril or into some version of pleasure.
Yeah, yeah. A colleague of mine, this just popped into my head as you were talking, a colleague of mine likes to not use the word feedback and use the word feed forward. That the conversation we're going to have, we hope, is going to move it forward. The other thing I also think about around this concept of giving anybody feedback, and seems, at least in my world and how I think about leadership, is so important, is, do we, as the leader, do we ask the people we're working with how best to give them feedback? Like, before any words even leave our mouth, do we explore some of the differences in how you said it, how I think about things? This is just my perception, but before I even share it with you, tell me, teach me from your experience, what's the best way I can give you any kind of feedback? And I think that conversation often doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's extremely important, and I've never really thought about it that way. Keith, that's an interesting that way of thinking. Feed forward is very interesting, but also the, how do you like to receive feedback is important. It's really probably no different than how you like to learn.
Yeah.
As well. But one of the there's so many correlations here, and it's interesting when we talk about having helping conversations is. Understanding someone's love language is so important. Right. And I think it makes a lot of people uncomfortable when I ask them what their love language is. It's like, I'm not asking you because I want to marry you. I want to know how I can keep you happy. Right. And that's, and when people tell you that it's gifts or words of affirmation, I mean, I've got a stack of gift cards on my desk right now that, when somebody does a great job, I can send a gift for $25 Starbucks.
Right.
But more importantly is I can praise you in public and give you some of that affirmation.
Yeah. Awesome book.
One of the things that, one of the things that's interesting that you said that, feed forward, what I learned a few years ago was the 2+2 feedback method. I don't know if you've heard
what's that?
Have you ever heard that?
No.
I think it's a great way. It's informal feedback. One of the first principles is feedback has to occur within 24 hours. Good or bad, you got to do it within 24 hours. It has a time limit on it. It's finite. I can't tell you that, hey, you remember that thing you did in October of 2016 and expect you to have any recollection of it. But the 2+2 feedback method is very easy. One did well from you, one did well from me, and then one do differently from you, and one do differently from me. So I'm going to praise you first, and I'm going to tell you the things that you're doing well before I offer you the thing. And I'm also going to set it up by allowing you to tell me first what you're going to have some critical insight, and hopefully we're going to share that thing.
Right.
And then the last piece of that conversation would be very simply me just saying, I agree with you, Keith. I think you've really done some great self-assessments on it, and here's the way that I would have thought about that differently.
Right.
But it really gives people the opportunity to come off their guard because I'm starting with praise.
Yeah. And in addition to starting with praise, that act of inviting them to give you feedback as the leader, again, when I think of concepts within leadership that have changed, that wasn't one of the things we thought about not that long ago, of a leader being courageous enough and allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, in this process, you give me some feedback as well. That's powerful. Very powerful. Yeah, that's awesome. I've
It's
never
not so
heard of that.
scary after the first time.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And again, if it's all couched within this relationship and trust and safety, and we want the best for each other, and we see each other as positively motivated, that makes this entire process of how we grow together as an organization, I would think, much more doable and much more productive.
That's right.
You talk about creating habits and not goals. I love that statement, because I thought about that a few moments ago, even when you were talking about the fear of inadequacy and fear of judgment, because some could make an argument that some of the habits that get in our way the most are not physical habits like biting your nails. They're habits of thinking and habits of feeling, where we go just so quickly. So talk a little bit about that, about your work and your thinking around creating habits versus jumping a little bit too quickly into goal setting.
Well, first and foremost, I am a big goal setter. I love goal setting, and I'm methodical about the way that I set goals. It's actually a little bit morbid. One of the very first things that I do in goal setting is I write my own obituary. I'm going to save the eulogist the effort. I'm going to write it there, because what I want to know at the very end is, what did I want to be most proud of?
I love that.
When I sit there, on my deathbed, and someone's asking me, Luke, what do you want me to say about you? Well, I want you to say that I was dedicated to my family.
Yeah.
I want you to say that I spent time with my passions. A few years ago, when I first began to explore these concepts, I used to say a rich man would ask, or what would you rather receive? Would you rather receive $1 million or the wisdom with which you would have attained at age 70? And the rich man, of course, says, I want the wisdom, right? And what he would tell you is, I wish I wouldn't have worked so hard. I wish I would have spent more time with my family.
Right.
Well, I don't need to be 70 to learn that lesson. The piece of the habits here is that, and this is, everybody kind of talks about New Year's resolutions and, whatever, is goals get met because we change our habits. If I'm going to be 175 pounds, it's going to be because I've made a commitment to my way of being. I'm going to be healthy first, and then I'm going to make a series of habits that's going to enforce that. So when I say I want to lose 10 pounds by October, that goal becomes arbitrary until I can enforce it with a habit. The habit is very simple. I think there's some common numbers there. There's something around 67 times before something becomes a habit.
Right.
So, the example that I just usually give is, I don't know who said this, but you don't get fat from eating one pizza, and you don't get skinny from running 1 mile. But the way that we do this is, the second piece of that, create habits, is put your shoes on. And every day, if I wake up in the morning, even if it's going to be hard for me to think about running a 10K or 5K or even the first mile, I'll tell you what's not hard is putting on tennis shoes. And if I put tennis shoes on or my running shoes on, it's going to be much easier for me to think about taking that first step, because I've already put myself in that frame of reference. And if I put running shoes on 67 days in a row, I guarantee you I am going to be moving towards my goal.
Right. It's a wonderful framework to think about how to break down goal setting into what's going to get me down the road. Right? The goal sounds awesome. The goals always sound awesome, but we know how many people set goals and launch off towards it and don't achieve it, and then it breaks down because the details weren't worked out. Those action steps, those habits, are the details of what makes the goal attainable.
That's an interesting. I talk about goals. What's interesting, I think the thing about goals is so important, is that I don't believe that goals are designed to get met. I don't believe that we get to the end of it and we say, hey, that's complete. I got to 175 pounds and I can quit now. Goals are set to do two things. One is to set your trajectory and to establish your playing field. So if you're a business person and you want to run a $50 million company, then you're taking yourself out of the league of $5 million companies, and you're taking yourself out of the league of $500 million companies. And I think it's important. So if you make it to a $36 million or you make it to a $60 million, it really doesn't matter, but you've established the playing field that you're going to be on.
Right, right. What do you see as some of the when you think of all the high performers that you have worked with, have mentored, have coached, and put yourself in there, what are some of the commonalities among those folks?
Accountability is one.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, being accountable to what you want to be accountable to. There's a fun exercise that I do with myself and I do with others. It's the 10 do more of, do less of list. It's, what we're really trying to figure out is we're really trying to figure out what the values are. And accountability is one of them. Especially in high performance individuals, we find ourselves accountable to things that are not value-based for us. So like a good example is if I tell you I want to have a $50 million company and I begin to work so hard for that, but I let everything else go by the wayside. I all of a sudden become that 300-pound, my marriage begins to fail or whatever it is. So being accountable, but then being specific about what you're being accountable to is extremely important. And then, the second piece of it that I think is just really important to note is that, there's some folks out there that talk about taking massive action. I just couldn't agree more or couldn't agree less with taking massive action. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think most of us are built to go 90 miles an hour all the time. I think what's important about action is taking imperfect and consistent action. If you just wake up every morning and you find the 3 priorities that are going to be the most important and have the highest impact for you, and then you move forward on those, that imperfect, consistent action is what's going to move you furthest forward.
All right. So I am thinking, Luke, that most people, when they think about wanting to become a high performer, the word imperfect is not in their vocabulary. That's fascinating. So say that again. 3 priorities in the morning.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I write it down. I'll show you. I mean, I have a book sitting right here beside me in my desk that's got my top 3 priorities in it.
For the day.
I know today what I want to do, but I know those, if I were to flip back over to the beginning, this is a great planner. This is the Michael Hyatt planner, is I know my goals, and I won't bore you with the details, but I know what I'm going after this quarter. And then I break it down into this week, and then I know what I need to do today. So on Sunday afternoon, when I'm planning my week out, I can tell you right then what the specific actions that I need to do between then and the next Sunday to move forward.
Right.
So in the morning there, I know my exact priorities. And if I just take imperfect action on those, awesome. It can be as simple as sending an email, picking up the phone, moving the ball forward on the thing that I need to move it forward. The plates keep spinning, whatever analogy you want, the balls keep moving forward on it.
And what just strikes me is I'm going back to where our conversation started today, where you said, I make decisions 90% of the time with 80% of the information. So again, setting those daily goals and then acting and getting the feedback, some of those action steps, those imperfect action steps will move it forward. Some, I imagine, just bring clarity, which sometimes I think is one of the greatest outcomes of trying something, is even if I don't get to wherever I wanted to get to, it brought clarity into the room.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, clarity is probably one of those great words of high performers, is having an understanding of what way that I'm going. If I don't know, if I don't see it very clearly, and I'll tell you right now, for me, my children are my highest priority above all else. And, but that's also reflected in my life, and hopefully those around me would go, here at the eulogy that Luke gave to his children, especially when they were young and they needed it. But I think clarity is such an important piece of those high performance activities.
Right. So I'm mindful of the time, because as always, this time just flies. But I wanted to ask about this Entrepreneurial Accelerator framework. So share a little bit about what that is.
Well, it's a great, concept there, Keith. When we talk about taking imperfect action, is that there's a lot of folks that want to start businesses, that want to be entrepreneurs, and the very first, the foundation of that is I don't want to have a boss. Well, you can throw that right out the window. You're the CEO. I tell you what, the IRS wants to have some accountability for you. The states want to. There's a lot of people that want to be your boss. But the Entrepreneurial Accelerator framework for me is it's very simple. And because I love alliteration, you need to start with a plan. You got to know where you're going. You got to create a product that can operate in the blue ocean, and it's not hard to do. There's, in Central North Carolina here, you can look around. I can start any number of businesses right now because there's a demand signal for it. I can start a barbershop to get a fresh, clean haircut. I can start a landscaping company because there's demand for it all around. But you need to create a product that you can operate in the blue ocean, and you need to discriminate and show your customers why you're better.
Right.
The third step is the placement, and that's the sales and marketing piece. A lot of folks that fear being in business, that's the hardest piece of it. That's the sales and marketing piece. But it's not hard. When you create a blue ocean product for yourself, whether that's a physical product or a service, or the service or your business. So the third P there is the placement. So plan, product, placement, and the fourth step is the process. I always say that you basically need to work yourself out of a job. The business that's the most valuable is the business that you can sell, even if you don't want to, because you don't need to be there to manage it on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of what I look for. Is I want to set up something that we can automate, and we can set the processes up in place that people can get themselves out of a job.
Right. So this framework that you have, I'm making an assumption here. You act on this framework both in your world as an entrepreneur and looking for entrepreneurial opportunities. And is this all also something that you would bring to coaching to people who are interested in becoming stronger either in the world of entrepreneurship and or leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Putting together a program to go through it, it takes about 12 weeks to be able to put it into place. But really, once you learn it and once you iterate on it, it's a constant improvement channel. You have to look at it creatively and critique yourself about what needs improvement in those things. So you're constantly in this phase. We're getting ready to do one in my business now about getting to the end of the first quarter, and we're going to get back into that planning cycle.
Right.
And we're going to figure out what we need to get after for the next, for us, one of the core tenets of it is that we operate on a 12-week cycle. We don't treat the year like it's the unit of measure that matters. We believe that the quarter is the unit of measure that matters because we can affect a change in that.
Right. That's a bit of a different look, a different mindset or framework than a lot of other businesses who seem to be very stuck on this. We come up with these year goals, and I don't know how often they stop along the way and measure and evaluate.
That's probably the highest thing that I would ever tell anybody is to change your unit of measure. We have this, especially in the American mindset, we have this mindset, the United States dollar is what matters. Well, dollar doesn't matter. The first thing about money, you didn't make it and you can't take it, is once we realize that money is just a currency, it's just a value exchange for goods and services between two willing parties, buyer and seller. Is we set all these metrics around money. We set, EBITDA and profit margins and gross revenue, and all these things. Well, I would just challenge that once you find your values and once you figure out your beliefs, is that you set the correct unit of measure. So for me, it's actually time. I measure mine in hours. And my worth, my time is actually measured in the number of hours that I spend with my kids. So the dollar is really a secondary metric. So one of the things that I really work to do is to change this paradigm that we should work for financial measures as the be all end all of our well-being.
Right. I'm thinking that is a leap, Luke, for a lot of folk, because as you just said it, this is what we have been taught is the primary measure of success, quotes around the word success. So to make that shift, invite people to shift into the relational world, your most important relationships as a sign of your success. I'm with you on that, but as you were saying that, I'm thinking, oh my, that's a big shift.
It is a big shift. And, one of the other shifts that entrepreneurs need to make is they need to stop thinking about their time in exchange for money.
Yeah.
If you can outwork your competitors, then every plumber and electrician and $20 an hour employee would be the most, they're all working hard.
Yeah.
But working hard will not get you anywhere in this world.
Right.
And once you can realize that, then you can really open up some new boundaries.
So if you were to change that framework from working hard to fill in the blank, what would you say?
Well, it's very easy for me. Is you have to work from a prioritized list. It's very simple.
Back to those values.
I want to make it very easy for folks. If you can come down from your strategy my businesses are a reflection of myself. I have a vision for what my life will look like at the end of it. And then I come all the way back down to what I need to do this year. But it's very simple. The only thing that you need to do to be a high performer is to be very clear about, like you said, about clarity and operate with intentionality. And if you can do that, then you're going to be light years ahead of your peers and be confident that you can just get done with the workday and put it behind you because you're already complete.
Right. The last thing I'm thinking as you're describing that is the skill to remain focused on everything you just said. So it's one thing to maybe identify it and say, here's my North Star, and this is what I'm going towards. But there's a certain tenacity in I'm staying focused on that. Other things that come along that could take me off that focus, I don't let that happen.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard for me. When I talk about living with intentional alignment, I talk about 3 pillars of health, wealth, and relationships, and they each get 30% of my time.
Right.
So, if I do the math on it, I'm going to spend more time with my kids on the weekend. But that's where that 8-hour day kind of comes in.
Yeah.
If you get 7 hours of sleep and an hour of physical fitness, and an 8-hour workday, well, the other 8 hours should be spent on your relationships, whether that's your family or your social, whatever it is. So, but that's the big component. And we see young entrepreneurs all the time that just lose their mind focusing on the wrong things. They're focused on working 60 or 70 hours a week. And when they let it go, they truly open the opportunity for growth.
Yeah. So of the folks who are listening, Luke, if someone is one of those people who finds themselves maybe having thought about entrepreneurship or thought about, how do I bring the best to my leadership, just some last words of wisdom to that person.
The hardest, and I can't unpack it in the last few minutes of our talk here, Keith, but the understanding that your business and those around you are only a reflection of you is you have to get extremely specific about what values and what beliefs that you have.
Right.
And when you unpack those and when you can get specific about what they are for yourself, you can then truly begin to help other people. So you can't tell somebody that you value future revenue. If you're a leader of a company and you're beating down the bottom line, that your value isn't money.
Yeah.
It's incongruent. It's not going to work for you or your company.
Right.
So that's the thing that I would tell you is get quiet, get silent, get honest with yourself. There's some great resources on the internet about how to figure out what those value-based alignments are.
Right. Yeah, I love it. Like this is all about us doing work on ourselves. And being, I like what you just said about being quiet. Boy, that is hard in our world, in our noisy world, to find that quiet space so we can go inside and do that clarity work before we take the first step. Luke, thank you so much. This was such an awesome conversation, and I so appreciate you making the time. If folks are interested in getting in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm all over the social channels, but my website's lukelayman.com, and you can find me on Facebook or Instagram or,
awesome.
Where LinkedIn's a great one as well. But always happy to engage and to hear new perspectives. And I certainly appreciate you having me today, Keith. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome. I will make sure, as always, that the website and the other social media connections are in the show notes. So whatever platform you happen to be listening to this podcast on, if you're interested in getting a hold of Luke, and if you are even thinking in any way, shape, or form about your role as a leader, maybe where you are right now, or moving forward, especially into the world of entrepreneurship, please get a hold of Luke. It would be a very worthwhile use of your time. So I'll make sure all that information is there. So again, Luke, thanks so much. And I hope you and I stay in touch. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation.
That's great, Keith. Thank you much.
All right, that is it for us for today. I hope this was a thought-provoking, inspiring, informational conversation. And again, leadership is a distinct skill set, and I invite you to work on that and bring your best to it. And again, if you are thinking about, I would love to have someone to talk to, there would not be anybody better than giving Luke a call, and he can share his thoughts and his experiences and his knowledge in this area. So I thank you for joining us today, and hope that you are with us for the next episode as we continue to shine a light on the skill and talent of those individuals that invite another into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the helping conversation. Everybody have a great day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the Helping Conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the helping conversation.